Hello, and welcome to the podcast's Early Christian Texts, the Bible, and Beyond. We explore historical and spiritual questions about Jesus, gender, women, salvation, healing, and the meaning of life. Shirley Paulson is hosting a series of conversations with scholars who are able to unlock mysteries from extra-canonical books, forgotten scriptures, so-called Gnostic Gospels, and the Bible. And for those of you who love our Bible and Beyond podcasts, would you please consider becoming a supporting member of our Patreon page? Go to patreon.com/Bible and Beyond to join at any level just right for you. And now, here's Shirley Paulson.
I have been wanting to talk to Dr. April DeConick for some time, and I'm so glad she's been able to be with us today on the Bible and Beyond podcast. She talks about Gnosticism in a way that's kind of different from the usual scholarly discussion, but she gets at the heart of its meaning in a way that I really appreciate. We've only had very rare chances to dig in so deep on our podcast here, and I think this is such an extremely important topic that needs more exposure. So let me introduce Professor DeConick a little bit before we get into the conversation. She holds the Isla, Carroll, and Percy E. Turney Professorship in New Testament and Early Christianity at Rice University, Department of Religion. She's written and taught on topics revolving around the silenced voices of religious people who were left behind or discarded when Christianity emerged in the first 4 centuries. She's the co-founder and executive editor of an academic journal, Gnosis, Journal of Gnostic Studies. In fact, this is what it looks like.
Yeah.
It's in the November 2023 edition of that journal that I found one of her articles that I thought would be really helpful to us. So I'm so grateful to you, April, for coming to be with us to unpack this a little bit, to get into the meaning of these silenced voices. Thank you.
Thank you. Absolutely glad to be here, Shirley.
Well,
I'm so glad you read that article.
I did. It's a great article. Thank you. And I want to say up front that I'm not wild about using the term Gnosticism because I think it's so misleading and so heavy laden with negative baggage. But I do think this topic is so important, and the lack of a proper term for it often gets in the way of even being able to discuss it. So, swallowing that discomfort, I really want to dig into this with you. Your scholarly theories are both technical and insightful, I think. And I'd like to see if we can find a way to get to your insightful ideas without requiring an academic background just to hear you. So let's try. So here we go. I like the way you point out that the understanding of the Gnostics requires human imagination. And that seems like a very different approach to the religious belief or practice. So can you start us off by telling us how imagination is so important for understanding just the concept of Gnostic? Let's go there first.
I know that you said that you're not wild about the term Gnostic or Gnosticism, but the truth of the matter is it's a concept that's been around since antiquity, and we can rename it, but it's still a concept that we need to discuss. And the ancient people use the word Gnostic, and so I like just to stick with that word and then kind of unpack what its meaning is. And the article that you're talking about is called "The Gnostic Imagination and Its Imaginaries," and it's where I'd really try to theorize better how the Gnostic emerges as a concept in antiquity, but then keeps reemerging and like reproducing itself, if you will, within different environments.
Mm-hmm.
And what's that process look like? And
Yeah.
so I rely a lot on cognitive studies and the whole concept of the human imagination being a creative, is our way to create and innovate and come up with new ideas to talk about our world. And our imagination will use all that's available to it culturally. Like everything that I know culturally, my imagination uses. And then I kind of put all that together in a new way, and I come up with a new concept. And that's what I argue is going on in antiquity with the Gnostic, that it's a really a new concept that emerges and gets applied to a religious identity.
Okay, that's fair enough. I get you. And I can go along with that kind of a word so long as we're getting a new meaning for it. So that I appreciate your saying it that way.
Yeah, okay, let's just say knowers.
Right. No worries. That's another great way to talk about them. Yeah. And I think that helps us to understand kind of what they mean without the heavy baggage. But I'm going with you on this. Now, you interestingly, you talk about how they're looking for something new. Is there some way you would think that they were objecting to something that made them look for something new? Or was it there's something that was broken that needed to be fixed? Or how do you look at that?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Shirley, and it's really the heart of what I'm talking about. So in the ancient world, religion functioned very differently from what it does today. And I think actually the emergence of the Gnostic is one of the things that kind of propelled religion toward its sort of therapeutic aspects and individual, in the kind of focus on the individual that the modern religion has, kind of taken on. But in antiquity, basically, religion was your civic duty. Gods were patrons of your city, your local area, or your ethnic group, and you were obligated to worship them, which in antiquity included praise, included feeding the gods their dinner or their breakfast or a fun celebratory meal or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
It included bathing the statues, so taking care of the statues and so forth. Um, and that was all built on a story. I call it a cognitive script or a kind of a cultural story of slavery, that slaves took care of their masters. They were required to do so. And that's the kind of relationship that the ancient people thought of when they thought of their gods. They were kind of slaves or servants to the gods, and they had to be obedient and do whatever the master wanted them to do. And there were some different modulations on that script. Sometimes they would talk about it. I call the vassal script, where they would have they'd see the god as a king, and they were the king's vassals or servants that owed him allegiance, or a patron to a client to a patron, where the god was the patron, and would do things for you, but you did things for him. So it was that sort of relationship. Now, divine justice was linked into those scripts. So if you, as the servant to the god, did what the god required you to do, then the god would protect you and take care of you. If you didn't, then he could send a famine to your city, or foreign invaders could come and overrun you, disease, and that sort of thing. And so it was really, really important for you to kind of stay in line and do your thing.
Wow.
But what happened in the Roman world is that the Romans were really harsh colonizers. And so when they moved into areas like into Egypt, or into Syria or Israel or any of these areas, they colonized the area and indentured a lot of the people into the army. And social mobility was, quite difficult. And I think that what my argument is that that there were certain people, I'm thinking particularly priests, who um, thought, hey, wait a minute. We've been serving our gods. We've been doing all the right things. And yet we've been colonized by these Romans, and we're now living this really terrible life. Like, where's divine justice?
Yeah.
And so they started to think about a kind of a different way to tell the religious story. And they built that story on what I call the kinship script, which was the idea that, what if we're not servants to the gods? What if we're children of the gods? And I don't mean adoptive children, but I mean really, like we would say today, like biologically or genetically gods. And that was the script that these knowers started to talk about. And they started to argue that the traditional gods, all of them, Yahweh included, were this kind of lesser class of gods that were below a supreme deity that they were akin to. And so that's where I think the kind of, if you want to call them origins of Gnostic thought, and that it begins within that environment.
Wow. So this is a revolutionary new way of even
Yeah.
envisioning a relationship with the deities at all.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah,
Wow.
because it ended up elevating the human above the traditional gods.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I
Yeah.
mean this was really, you can see that, can see that in modern thought, right? That sort of elevation of the human. And yeah, it's this was really
Wow.
revolutionary. That's why my book, The Gnostic New Age, I titled it, a countercultural spirituality that revolutionized religion. I really mean that. It wasn't meant
Yeah.
to be like an entertaining title. I mean
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
just a serious title.
Right. So, part of the other broken world that they were living in was the way, as you're talking about, they were being oppressed by the Romans and colonized by them, but also they were even tearing families apart. Did that have anything to do with the way they were conceiving this new relationship with, as you say, being a child of God? I mean, what did the family idea do then?
Yeah. So they took that exact story of being sort of with their family, and then the army would come in and kind of rip the family apart, and the guy would go off into the service. They never see them again. They used that as the storyline for how we as humans kind of got stuck in this world underneath these subservient gods. Those are the Romans.
Mm.
How we
Yeah.
got stuck here. We were basically conscripted. So we fell, we were torn away from the supreme deity, we were torn away from it. And we were embedded and imprisoned within this situation of indenture, or whatever you want to call
Mhm.
it.
Mhm.
And so in their mind, I can't get out of that on my own. Like there's nothing I can do. I'm stuck.
Yeah.
And so that's when they developed this idea that a divine entity has to come down. And in the Christian stories, of course, that's Jesus comes down in order to rectify that situation,
Mm.
release me from this indenture so that I can get home when I die.
When you die, not
Yeah.
before, huh?
They developed rituals that they used in order to kind of program to show the person the way home, so that
Okay.
when the soul at death separated from the body, it wouldn't get caught back within the system. Yeah.
Okay, so then how does a family of God then actually function? Like are the children independent gods,
Yeah.
what is the relationship then? So,
Yeah, no, we are. This is one of the things that got Plotinus upset with the Gnostics, that he knew in the third century, was this idea that they were, better than the gods, and they were better than Plato, and they knew better than anybody else. Yeah.
so that would make people feel kind of like they were carrying arrogant attitudes that was above everybody
Right.
else. I can see why people get mad at them for that.
Yep. Yep. And they're criticized for that. Now, I mean, whether or not they truly were arrogant, or whether or not the person who was doing the criticizing realized what they were saying, which is kind of what I think was the case. I mean, they were like, wait a minute. You're saying that you're above Plato. You're saying that you're above the traditional gods, huh? That's hubris. And in antiquity, hubris was a very, very bad thing. You didn't want to have hubris, because then the gods could come and do all kinds of terrible things to you in punishment.
Oh my goodness. So there's more than just a disagreement over things. There is a lot of God in the middle of you in
Oh
the
yeah.
argument. How did this work out practically if you're thinking of yourself in, as you say, imagining yourself in another way? Is this just you dream about this when you're daydreaming, or how do
Oh,
you live the difference?
yeah. Yeah, now this gets to the heart of it, doesn't it, Shirley?
Yeah, okay, yeah, yeah.
Okay, so these guys weren't just intellectually thinking about this stuff. They were practicing. They were practicing a sense. So they had particular bodily practices that they did that altered their state of consciousness. That's the only way that I can kind of talk about it with you. Like it put themselves in different states of consciousness, in which they claim that they would experience like that God. They would like meet and greet him. That was what they meant by the term Gnostic, that they knew God, that they didn't just know about him intellectually, but they'd met this God, they'd ascended to his home, they knew where they were from, and that they were going to go back there at death. So they were practicing those ascents.
Okay. So, so you're talking about knowing, then, this very different from knowing like material facts, but rather it's more like,
Right.
as you're saying, it's kind of an alternate consciousness, or we might even call it metaphysics. Would you call it metaphysical or spiritual, or what would you call this?
So when I think of gnosis, I think of surely like, I know you. Like,
Okay.
okay, that's gnosis. I have a relationship with you. I know you. I've met you, rather than I know about you from reading about you or anything like that. So it's really it's like that. They thought that knowledge was spiritual divine knowledge, that this happened to them, that it actually happened to them as spiritual beings meeting another spiritual being.
Okay. All right. So then this didn't go down easy with everybody. The church father Irenaeus in
Yeah.
the late second century, for example, identified as a heresy, even though I think heresy is also another heavily laden word. But
Yeah, heresy just means sectarian. It
okay,
just means that
right.
it's a sect, that a religious sect that somebody chooses to join, or a club or something like that. It's but Irenaeus gives it a negative spin.
So talk about that. What do you mean by that then?
Yeah, so he uses the word to say that. So what he's doing, he's part of a movement of Christians that are consolidating into what I call the Great Church. They call it the Great Church, but I call it the Great Church as well, which is basically Catholicism, before Catholicism. So
Okay,
it's,
okay,
I don't really want to call it proto. It's not really proto. It's just the, out of these traditions, the Catholics make themselves, right?
okay, all right,
And so, in the middle of the second century, and by the time of Irenaeus, they have really started to consolidate in a lot of churches into their movement, bring a lot of churches in, and in doing that, they're also excluding a lot of churches that are not, that don't go along with their ideas and their practices. And so, the ones that don't go along are the ones that Irenaeus is objecting to, and he wants to understand them, um, and he labels them as heresies, right? Now, he's not the first one to do that. We have Christians before them that are also, within this consolidation process, are also, trying to do this. But Irenaeus has a big project in trying to understand what it really means to be Christian.
okay,
And at his time, there were basically, I call them three different Christian families. And by that, I mean, there are three groupings of Christians. And within those groupings, there are different Christian groups, but the groupings are based on their theology. So
okay,
you have the one that we understand the most today, and those are the Yahwist Christians. They're worshiping Yahweh, the biblical God, just like the Jews worship the same God. Okay.
okay.
Then you have the Marcionites, who are worshiping a transcendent God, but this God has no connection to our world. So, like, he didn't originate this world. He didn't start life here. He's a God, just a different God, a totally alien God. This, by the way, is also an innovative new script. That first time we see it in history. Third family is where our Gnostics are clustering around, and they're the transcendentalists. They're the ones that think that there is a supreme God who's not the biblical creator God. He's not the God that the Jews and other Christians are worshiping, but he is this transcendent God who starts life for our universe. But there's a lower creator who creates things, and he doesn't mess things up. He just is a lower creator, and the world's not perfect because of that.
Well, are these three groups that you're talking about really from the Jewish world, or were the pagans also getting into this, or how widespread was this?
Yes, well, okay. I should be more clear. So these groupings, there's just as how I organized all the different Christian groups in the second century,
Okay.
is that I've noticed that theologically we have three different Christian types of Christianity, worshiping different gods. And
Mhm.
I think Irenaeus understood that. And he's like, wait a minute. You guys are not even worshiping the same God we worship in our church. You aren't really Christians. You're polytheists because you got the supreme God. And then, of course, the God I worship, you have him too in there. But the truth is that all these Gnostic groups were total monotheists. They were worshiping only the one God, and all the rest are just angels or, kind of lesser entities in their system. But that's not how Irenaeus frames them for us.
So in other words, Irenaeus didn't really totally understand them in this process of disagreeing with them.
I think he understood it. I think he was trying to polemicize.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Fair enough. Yeah. And then what about Clement of Alexandria? He's another one around that time, a little bit younger, but he gets involved in the picture too, doesn't he? How does he work?
Yeah, so he's in Alexandria.
Yeah.
So he's about, 30 years after, 20, 30 years after Irenaeus. He's in a different environment. And in Alexandria, the Valentinians are very popular. These were a Gnostic group. They had a kind of a competing church at this time with the church of the basically the Catholics. And so Clement really has to face how do I now, here are these Valentinians who are really popular, who are claiming they have the secret knowledge, that they got the special initiation program, that they're going to, tell you guys the mysteries and all that. We got to compete with that. And so he takes the word Gnostic, he takes that identity and he flips it and he makes it now work and apply to I call them like uber Catholics, these special Catholics that go under training under him, who learn how to do all of these ascents, same program, but instead of going to this transcendent entity, they're going to see the biblical God, who they say is the transcendent entity. So they've connected those two. They've linked those two. So he takes on it. He loves the word Gnostic and he just takes it over for the Catholics. And really, once he does that, kind of the Valentinian tradition loses its oomph, right? Because it no longer can outcompete the Catholics on that one, because now the Catholics can claim to have a similar tradition.
Well, so the Catholics then, and we're talking about Clement of Alexandria all this time, right? Okay, so the Catholics are sort of taking on this this Valentinian, and we have talked about Valentinian in our Bible Beyond world. Clement of Alexandria then is taking on this Valentinian style of the Gnostics, and so that then at that point, that's when the Gnostics sort of faded away from that role.
There's lots of reasons, and there's so many different groups. Each one you really have to look at and say, okay, well, why did their movement fail? Why did it survive this long and not that? I mean, everyone. But for the Valentinians, I mean, they're still around in the 3rd century. But once the Catholics develop the idea that they have a secret tradition and that you can learn it through their school, through their education, because it didn't come through the bishops, which is really interesting. Clement claimed it came through the educators, so they're your theologians. I think once that happened, then the Valentinians don't have the market on that anymore.
Interesting. Let's go back to your initial idea there about imagination. I like to think about how that was a means for fixing what wasn't working. And you point out that individuals who have some kind of radical imagination and they're shared publicly, how did this kind of social or collective imagination then work?
Yeah, that's the one area that I think we need to work on more, is to try to understand how the radical imagination is what we call the imagination, like something like I imagine and innovate something new. That would be April's radical imagination, right? But how does that then become something that a collection of people like buy into and then create like a church around it, or a movement, some kind of social movement? So how does the radical imagination of the individual become a social imagination that more than one person share, and then they can either just share it like we do, like maybe share something on the internet, or they can use that to build a community, an actual community, actual movement.
Mhm.
So there were some radical imaginaries like Valentinuses, Justin's. Here I'm talking about Justin the Gnostic, that did go communal, that did develop kind of communities around them and ways to interpret text together, to do certain rituals together, lifestyle, whether I should be married or not, for instance. I mean, things like lots of things. We don't understand how that necessarily happens, but we know it happens. and I can tell you that it definitely happened in antiquity, and it still happens today.
That's interesting. So, do you think that this is similar to the way the other two groups organize themselves too, or is it different with these Gnostics, the way they
You
organize
mean, oh
themselves?
yeah, no, everybody. This is how it works just in general. So
Okay.
surely you could have a radically new idea, and a bunch of people could collectively buy into that idea and share it with you. Then it becomes a social imaginary.
I
And
see.
then if I mobilize it into a community where we're going to start doing stuff based on it, it's
Okay.
like we're going to share that as our metaphysics now. We're going to open a church.
Right.
Then I've
Okay.
got a social movement. Does that make sense?
Yeah, right. So, and I'm just trying to understand how these things kind of moved around because you pointed out that this reappears in history over and over and over again. And do you think it's because people have new insights all of a sudden, or that they go back and realize there was something that works, or how did that keep
Yeah, it's
happening?
both. And so what I'm really interested right now for the rest of my career is to try to understand, call it artifact migration. So these ancient texts are so fascinating because they get detached from that social imagination, right? They get
Okay.
detached from the social movement, and now in modernity, like, they're just hanging around there. And so people pick them up and they do different things with them. Some of them use them to create new social movements. Some of them use them to make a philosophy or a metaphysics that they personally want to live by, that they don't collectively share with anybody. Sometimes people just take most of the time. In fact, I say almost 100% of the time, this stuff is taken up selectively, so
Mm,
partially. It's never in total. It's always just a partial amount of knowledge that's then used to build something. And I'm super interested in some of the people I call alpha channels, who when these Gnostic materials came into modernity through the publication of, like, Pistis Sophia, for instance, or the Nag Hammadi collection, there are certain kind of intellectuals that work to migrate that stuff into the kind of public knowledge, right?
mm.
So Blavatsky was one of these people that did this, and through theosophy. And so I consider her an alpha channel. And then she's got other people who then will take her understanding of this material and then they build off of that. So you
Okay.
kind of got a
Okay.
second level. It's really complicated.
Yeah, it is. Well, it's interesting when you talk about this imagination. When we in the 21st century go back and discover these ancient things that we've never heard of before, we run
Right.
across really weird terms like barbaloids and ophite and Simonian, and they have no meaning to us.
Right. Those are the social imaginaries.
Okay. Right. So how would you describe them so that we can make sense that when we run across these words, what do they mean to us? Should we ignore them because they don't have any
No,
meaning?
I don't think we should ignore them. I think that we should acknowledge the fact that they represented in antiquity groups of people. And, so the Valentinians had a particular metaphysics. They worshiped a particular god. They wrote texts. They had their own rituals, and they lasted intergenerationally. They were probably the most well equipped to compete with the Catholics. So, or the Simonians, they were another group. They're not actually initially a Christian group. They're actually a Samaritan group, a sectarian Samaritan group. And they were competitors to the first Christians. I mean, those were the guys. It was, did you follow Simon or did you follow Jesus? And of course, we've sort of lost the Simon story in our cultural, on kind of our general cultural knowledge, but in antiquity, he was super popular.
And what about Ophite? Where did that come from?
Yeah, so the Ophites, that comes from this reverse reading of the Genesis story. So there were some people who started to read the Genesis story where the snake was a good entity who told who gave knowledge to Eve, which was a good thing. And then that meant that the God was a trickster who was trying to stop the human from gaining the true knowledge of the God above him, right? So that that reverse reading is usually labeled the Ophite reading, although we also have a Barbalite reading, which is similar to it, which is another one of these groups. And that really is a good point to raise, because a lot of this can be convergent. And what I mean by that is thinkers don't have to know about each other to come up with similar stuff. Like similar innovations, as long as they're reading the same text and they're kind of within the same cultural milieu, you're going to generate those possibilities, right? So yeah,
That's really so. That could be partially why this can reappear in different generations without people knowing the previous generation. That's sort of
and this gets even weirder, surely, because if I'm right about this kinship script, kind of like once it's applied to religion, so when a person thinks they're now kin to the God, right, and has become separated from the God, that's cross-cultural. That's a cross-cultural story.
Right. Okay.
So now if I start let's say I live in Tibet and I start applying that kinship idea to Hinduism,
okay,
then I may end up with a Gnostic looking new religion coming out of it. I have no reason to call it Gnostic. I wouldn't even know anything about that. I call it whatever. But some of those ideas in there are going to map and parallel with ideas in other cultures that are running the same script.
well then on that's an interesting lead into the next question I have is how do they fit with Jewish and Christian context then?
The stories, or
Yeah, well, these sort of imaginaries with these sort of Gnostic ideas. How do
yeah, I mean, these imaginaries, the Gnostic imaginary it's not reliant on a religion.
Okay, I see.
Right
Sure.
now, it can become embedded in religion, in specific religions. So it does become embedded within Christian thought.
Okay.
It becomes embedded within some people would say Jewish thought. Some other people would disagree with that. So I leave that for you. The Gnostic imaginary becomes embedded with the Hermetic thought. There's no question about that in my mind. And to some extent, it's embedded in Neoplatonism. That's a whole other topic, but Plotinus, in my opinion, was influenced greatly by the Valentinians and maybe the Sethians that he met in Alexandria. So, yeah.
Wow. Well, you have whetted our appetite with this. I know that there's so much more to this whole subject. It gets even more complex, but I really appreciate the way you're helping us to just imagine that this is not a religion the way we thought of religion, but it's a whole new way of thinking that we can understand it much better from this new paradigm, I think I should.
Yeah, because it allows the idea to travel.
Yeah, good.
Because that's what it did. It traveled. And all I'm trying to do is describe theoretically what I see happening on the ground.
Interesting.
Yeah. So yeah, and I mean, as your interest in this article has made me think, hey, maybe I just need to go sit back down with that article and just break it apart and make it into a larger book or something that's more accessible.
I think you do, because there's so much in that article. I think we only covered about a third of it.
I know.
There's a lot more there that we could be talking about, but I think this is enough for us to digest for today.
All right. Thanks so much, Shirley.
Oh, thanks so much. It's been wonderful to be with you, April. I really appreciate it.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you, listeners, for being with us today. Be sure to check out the details from this episode from the show notes on the website earlychristiantexts.com, or just come browse around on the website to find all the other resources provided for you there. Also, we ask for your support to keep producing these podcast interviews. Please consider becoming a supporting member of our Patreon page at patreon.com/BibleandBeyond. And we love hearing from you on the Facebook page at Early Christian Texts or Twitter at EarlyXIAN Texts. Be sure to come back next month for our next episode on Early Christian Texts, the Bible, and Beyond.